The soft clinking of silverware filled the air as Daniel moved quietly between tables. It was a typical evening at the diner, the kind of night that blurred into the next. The low hum of conversation surrounded him, each voice merging with the sounds of plates scraping and cups being set down, creating a kind of white noise that Daniel had long grown accustomed to. The diner itself was modest, tucked away on the corner of a forgotten street in a town where nothing much ever seemed to change. The walls were adorned with faded pictures of the town's past, a stark contrast to the current reality of slow business and worn-down interiors. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and the slight grease from the kitchen hung in the air, familiar and comforting. Daniel had been working here for years. At 35, he had mastered the art of blending into the background. His quiet demeanor and efficient service made him a fixture in the diner, though most patrons hardly noticed him. It was his way, serve without being seen. He preferred it that way. The regulars trickled in, nodding to him as they took their usual spots. Daniel moved with purpose, his steps measured and deliberate. He wasn't a man of many words, but he knew the orders by heart, delivering meals with a quiet nod and a small smile that barely reached his lips. As the evening progressed, a young couple entered, looking out of place in the otherwise somber atmosphere. They sat near the window, their faces drawn with fatigue, and Daniel noted the tension between them. The woman, Sarah, looked out the window with a distracted expression while Tom, her companion, fiddled with a few crumpled bills on the table. Daniel approached, his notepad ready, but his eyes caught the couple's silent exchange. Tom whispered something to Sarah, his face tight with concern. She shook her head, her hands wringing the fabric of her coat. The scene was all too familiar to Daniel. Too much worry, not enough money. "Just coffee, please," Tom said, his voice strained. Daniel nodded, his face betraying no emotion as he headed back to the counter to prepare their order. But something about the couple lingered in his mind. There was a fragility in the way they interacted, something unspoken that resonated with him. As he poured the coffee, he glanced at them again, catching a glimpse of Sarah's tired eyes as she stared at the few coins on the table. The image struck him harder than he expected. As the hours passed, the diner slowly emptied. The couple remained, sipping their coffee in silence. Daniel kept his distance, moving through his closing tasks with quiet efficiency, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. Something about them reminded him too much of his own past, a time when he had been on the other side of the table, counting change and wondering how to make ends meet. As he wiped down the counter, Daniel noticed Tom counting the coins again, his face pale under the dim diner lights. He glanced over at Sarah, her face a mixture of exhaustion and embarrassment. Daniel didn't need to hear their conversation to know what was happening. They didn't have enough to pay for the coffee. Without a second thought, Daniel made his way to the register. He punched in a few keys and quickly slipped some bills from his tip jar into the register drawer. He had done this before, though never in such a quiet and deliberate manner. His hands moved as if by instinct, as if this small act of kindness was as routine as clearing a table or refilling a cup. When Tom stood to pay, he looked confused. "Are you sure?" he asked, glancing at the receipt that showed their bill as already settled. Daniel nodded. "It's all taken care of," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The couple stared at him, speechless for a moment, before a wave of gratitude washed over their faces. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. Tom, too overwhelmed to speak, simply nodded, his eyes conveying what words couldn't. Daniel gave them a small smile, just a fleeting curve of his lips, before turning away. He felt a strange mix of satisfaction and discomfort. Helping others was a part of who he was, but it never felt like enough. As the couple left, he returned to his cleaning, trying to push the moment from his mind, but the weight of it clung to him. Outside the diner, the couple paused in the cool night air. Sarah looked back through the window, watching as Daniel moved through the diner like a ghost, unnoticed by the world. "We should thank him properly," she said quietly. Tom nodded in agreement, still holding the receipt in his hand. Inside, Daniel stood by the window, staring out at the empty street. His mind wandered back to his own struggles, to the nights he'd spent in places just like this, hoping for a small act of kindness that might change the course of his life. Perhaps tonight he had been that kindness for someone else. But as the lights dimmed and the diner closed for the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. Sarah and Tom walked down the empty streets after leaving the diner, the cool night air wrapping around them, the weight of what had just happened pressed on them. They were both grateful for the unexpected kindness, but the act itself only served as a reminder of how far they had fallen. Sarah sighed, her breath visible in the cold air. "We can't keep living like this, Tom." Tom, his hands stuffed into his pockets, nodded in agreement, but said nothing. Words felt useless at this point. They had been scraping by for months, with each week feeling like a new battle for survival. Jobs were scarce, bills were piling up, and even small luxuries like coffee at the diner felt like too much. Their apartment wasn't far from the diner, a tiny one-bedroom with peeling paint and a leaky faucet. The furniture was mismatched and old, relics from thrift stores and hand-me-downs from family. Tom had taken odd jobs here and there, but nothing stable had come his way in months. Sarah had been working part-time at a retail shop, but her hours were constantly cut, and the paycheck barely covered groceries. "Maybe we should leave town," Sarah said as they approached their building. She had mentioned this idea before, but Tom always pushed back, hopeful that things would turn around. Now, as they stood in front of their apartment building, Tom finally paused. "Maybe," he muttered, staring at the ground. He didn't want to leave, but he was starting to accept that they might have no choice. They climbed the stairs to their apartment in silence, both lost in thought. The gesture from the waiter had been simple, but it carried so much more weight than just paying for a cup of coffee. It had reminded them of how fragile their situation was and how quickly they could lose everything. Inside, Sarah sat on the edge of their worn couch, running her fingers through her hair. "We owe that waiter more than just thanks," she said softly. "I don't know what, but we have to do something." Tom sat beside her, the creak of the old couch filling the silence between them. "I know, but what can we do? We can barely take care of ourselves." The room was dimly lit by a small lamp in the corner, casting long shadows on the walls. The silence between them grew, punctuated only by the distant sounds of cars passing by outside. They had each other, but at times, it felt like their struggles were pulling them apart. Tom looked over at Sarah, the worry etched into her face. He hated seeing her like this. "We'll figure out," Tom finally said, though he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. "We always do." But as Sarah leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, Tom couldn't shake the gnawing doubt that this time might be different. Meanwhile, at the diner, Daniel locked the front door behind him, the click of the deadbolt echoing in the quiet night. He stood still for a moment, staring out at the dark street, his thoughts distant. The couple's faces kept flashing in his mind, how they looked at each other, the quiet desperation they shared. He'd seen it before. In fact, he had lived it. As Daniel walked to his modest apartment just a few blocks from the diner, memories from his past surfaced, times when he was the one with empty pockets, counting change, trying to stretch every dollar. He had worked jobs like this one for years, doing whatever he could to get by. His life had been a series of odd jobs and small paychecks, each one just enough to survive, but never enough to really live. Arriving home, Daniel opened the door to his small, sparsely furnished apartment. It wasn't much, but it was his. The room was neat and orderly, reflecting the careful control he tried to maintain over his life. A small table, a chair, a few books on the shelf, nothing extravagant, just enough to make it through each day. He sat down at the table, rubbing his eyes as exhaustion set in. The memory of the couple at the diner tugged at him. He had helped them, but in a way, they had stirred something inside him, too. Their struggles mirrored his own, but there was a vulnerability in their situation that reminded him of a time when he wasn't sure if he'd ever find solid ground again. Daniel hadn't always been so quiet. There was a time when he had dreams, ambitions, things that seemed so distant now. But life had a way of wearing you down. Over time, the constant battle just to make ends meet left him tired, and he began to withdraw, fading into the background wherever he went. The act of helping others, though small, was one way he kept himself connected to the world. It was how he reminded himself that even in the midst of his own struggles, he could still make a difference, however minor. But deep down, Daniel knew that he, too, was barely getting by. His financial situation wasn't stable, and he often wondered how long he could continue living this way. As he stared at the few bills he had left on the table, Daniel's mind wandered to the couple. There was something about them that felt familiar, too familiar. He didn't know their story, but he didn't need to. He had lived it his own way, and that was enough to understand the weight they carried. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, he found it harder than usual to fall asleep. His mind kept drifting back to Sarah and Tom, wondering what their next move would be, whether they had a plan, and whether they would make out of this. He didn't know why he cared so much. After all, they were just customers. But something about them had unsettled the careful balance he had created in his life. And though he didn't know it yet, that single act of kindness had set something in motion. The next day, Sarah and Tom found themselves back at the diner. They hadn't planned on returning so soon. After all, every dollar counted. But something pulled them back. Maybe it was a sense of unfinished business, or maybe it was just the hope that being there again might offer some clarity. As they walked in, Daniel greeted them with his usual quiet nod. There was no indication that he remembered them, no special acknowledgement of the previous night's events, and for a moment, Sarah and Tom wondered if he even realized they were the same couple. They took the same seat by the window. The sun was shining through the glass, casting a warm glow on the table, but the tension between them remained. They ordered the cheapest items on the menu, more out of obligation than hunger. As they sipped their coffee in silence, Sarah couldn't stop glancing at Daniel. There was something about him that intrigued her, something in his quiet presence that felt both familiar and distant. She had noticed the small gesture he made the night before, how quickly he dismissed their thanks, and how he carried himself like someone who had been through struggles of his own. When Daniel approached to refill their cups, Sarah hesitated, but the words spilled out before she could stop them. "Why did you help us last night?" Tom looked up from his cup, surprised that she had asked so directly. Daniel paused for a moment, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to the coffee pot. "It seemed like the right thing to do," Daniel replied simply. His voice was calm, steady, as if the question hadn't caught him off guard. "But you didn't have to," Tom added. "We would have figured something out." Daniel gave a small shrug, the kind that said more than words ever could. Sometimes, we all need a little help. There was something in his tone that suggested he understood more than he let on, and for a moment, the couple sat in silence, unsure of what to say next. They wanted to ask more, to understand why someone like Daniel, who seemed to blend into the background, had stepped forward to help them when they needed it most. As Daniel walked away to tend to another table, Sarah leaned toward Tom. "There's more to him than we know," she whispered. "I think he's been through something like this before." Tom nodded. "Yeah, I think so too. Maybe that's why he's so quiet." They finished their meal, and as they prepared to leave, Sarah stopped by the counter where Daniel was cleaning up. "Thank you again," she said softly. "We're really grateful." Daniel didn't look up, but there was a faint smile on his face as he replied, "Take care." As Sarah and Tom stepped out into the bright afternoon, they both felt a strange sense of connection to the silent waiter. They didn't know his story, but somehow, they sensed that their lives had become intertwined in a way they couldn't yet explain. The following week, Sarah and Tom made a plan. They couldn't let Daniel's kindness go unanswered. Despite their financial struggles, they had managed to save a little from Tom's last odd job, and they decided to leave a generous tip for Daniel, hoping it would show him just how much his gesture had meant to them. They returned to the diner, slipping the tip under the salt shaker after finishing their meal. Sarah smiled as they walked out the door, feeling a sense of satisfaction that they had repaid a debt, however small. But when they came back the next day, the tip was waiting for them, neatly folded and placed back in an envelope with their names written on it. It sat on the table where they usually sat, untouched, and as if Daniel had known they would return. Sarah picked up the envelope, her heart sinking. "He gave it back," she whispered, glancing at Tom. "Why would he do that?" Tom frowned, confusion and frustration bubbling up inside him. "Maybe he didn't need it." "But that's not the point," Sarah said, feeling her frustration rise. "We weren't just trying to pay him back. We wanted to show him we care." They sat down, staring at the envelope in silence. The gesture, so carefully thought out, had been quietly rejected, and they were left wondering why. Tom's frustration only grew, feeling like they had failed in their attempt to give back to someone who had helped them. When Daniel approached their table to take their order, Tom couldn't hold back any longer. "Why didn't you keep the tip?" he asked, his voice tight. Daniel, ever calm, glanced down at the envelope and then back at Tom. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "But we wanted to," Sarah added. "It wasn't just about the money. We wanted to thank you." Daniel sighed softly, his eyes softening as he looked at the couple. "I didn't help you because I wanted something in return," he explained. "I helped because I've been where you are, and I know how hard it is to accept help when you feel like you should be able to do it on your own." Tom's frustration eased slightly, but the tension remained. "But we don't want to feel like we owe you." "You don't," Daniel said, his voice gentle but firm. "You never did." Sarah and Tom exchanged a glance, their emotions tangled between gratitude and frustration. They had wanted to repay Daniel's kindness, to show him that they cared, but now it felt like they were being pushed away. Daniel's refusal to accept their tip felt like a wall between them, one that they didn't know how to break down. As Daniel walked away, Sarah leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. "He's hiding something," she murmured. "I don't know what, but there's more to him than he's letting on." Tom nodded, but he didn't know how to respond. All he knew was that the more they tried to connect with Daniel, the more distant he seemed to become. The tension between Sarah and Tom had been simmering for weeks, but after their last encounter with Daniel, it felt as if something had shifted in their relationship. The kindness he had shown them, and their failed attempt to repay it, seemed to intensify the strain they were already under. Now, even the smallest things between them turned into arguments. One evening, after a long day of job hunting, Tom sat on the couch, staring at the pile of bills on the table. The rent was due in a week, and they didn't have enough to cover it. Sarah, sitting at the small dining table, worked on her laptop, searching for job listings that seemed fewer and farther between with each passing day. "We can't keep going like this," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, but carried the weight of months of worry and exhaustion. Tom didn't look up. "What do you want me to do, Sarah?" "I'm trying. I'm out there every day looking for work." "I know," she replied, her tone softening. "I'm trying too, but we're just stuck. Maybe we need to consider leaving." Tom finally looked up, his eyes tired but sharp. "You want to leave? Where would we even go?" "Anywhere," Sarah said, the frustration building in her voice. "Somewhere that isn't here. We can't keep living in this cycle, just barely getting by." Tom shook his head. "And how do you think we're going to afford to move? We don't even have enough for rent this month." "I don't know." Sarah snapped, standing up and pushing her chair back. "I don't know, Tom, but we have to do something." The argument, like so many before, ended in silence. Sarah walked to the bedroom, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts and the stack of bills. He knew she was right. They couldn't keep living this way. But the idea of leaving, of starting over somewhere else, felt impossible. Everything they had was tied to this place, even if that everything wasn't much. The thought of Daniel crossed his mind. The silent waiter had helped them, but even his kindness felt like a reminder of their failures. Why was it so hard to accept help? Why did it feel like every time they tried to give back, they were only met with rejection? Tom didn't know the answers, but he knew something had to change, either with their situation or with the way they faced it. In the dim light of their apartment, Tom sat in silence, the weight of their struggles pressing down on him. He glanced toward the bedroom, where Sarah lay in bed, the distance between them growing each day. He wanted to fix things, but he didn't know how. The next time they visited the diner, the atmosphere between Sarah and Tom was noticeably tense. They sat quietly, the weight of their recent argument hanging in the air between them. Daniel, as usual, moved through the diner with his usual quiet efficiency, but even he seemed to notice the strain. When Daniel approached to refill their cups, Sarah looked up at him, her frustration bubbling over. "Why won't you let us help you?" Daniel paused, his hand still holding the coffee pot. He glanced between them, his calm demeanor never wavering. "It's not about that," he replied, his voice low and measured. "I didn't help you because I wanted something in return." "But why not let us give back?" Tom interjected, his voice strained. "We're trying to show you that we care. We're trying to, I don't know, be friends, I guess." Daniel looked down at the table, his fingers tightening around the coffee pot's handle. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I've been where you are." Sarah and Tom exchanged a glance, their curiosity piqued. Daniel never spoke about himself. He was always the quiet observer, the silent helper, never revealing anything personal. But now, there was something different in his voice, something vulnerable. "I was in a similar situation a few years ago," Daniel continued, his eyes distant as if he were looking back at a memory. "I lost everything, my job, my apartment. I was living out of my car for months, just trying to survive. And during that time, a stranger helped me, paid for my meals when I couldn't, gave me a place to stay when I had nowhere to go." He set the coffee pot down on the table and sat across from them, his voice growing quieter as he spoke. "That person never asked for anything in return. They didn't need me to repay them. They just wanted to help. And because of that, I got back on my feet. That's why I do what I do. Not because I want something back, but because I know what it feels like to be on the other side." Sarah and Tom sat in stunned silence. They had never imagined that Daniel, the quiet, reserved waiter who seemed to fade into the background, had lived through something so similar to their own struggles. It was as if the wall between them had suddenly come down, revealing a part of Daniel they hadn't known existed. "But don't you want, I don't know, something more than this?" Sarah asked, her voice softer now. "You're still working here. You're still—" "I'm still getting by," Daniel interrupted gently. "Just like you are. And that's enough for now." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Daniel's story had shifted something inside them, a realization that perhaps they weren't so alone after all. They weren't the only ones struggling, and maybe, just maybe, there was hope for them yet. As they left the diner that night, Sarah and Tom walked in silence, but the tension between them had eased. The revelation of Daniel's past had given them a new perspective, not only on him, but on their own situation. Maybe they couldn't repay Daniel in the way they had wanted, but they could find their own way forward together. The next few days passed in relative quiet, but the underlying tension remained between Sarah and Tom. They had learned more about Daniel's past, yet it still felt as though there was something unresolved. Tom, especially, couldn't let go of the frustration that had been building inside him. He respected Daniel, even admired him in some ways, but the silent waiter's insistence on remaining distant, on refusing their attempts to help, gnawed at him. One evening, after another unsuccessful day of job hunting, Tom found himself growing restless. He felt the need to confront Daniel, to force a conversation that had been avoided for too long. "I'm going back to the diner," he announced suddenly, standing up from the couch. Sarah, startled by the abruptness, looked up from her laptop. Why? "I need to talk to him," Tom said, grabbing his coat. "I need to know why he won't let us help him, why he keeps pushing us away. I don't get it." Sarah frowned, concerned. "Tom, maybe we should just let it go. He's been through enough." "I'm not letting it go," Tom interrupted, his frustration clear. "He helped us when we were at our lowest, and now we're trying to do the same for him. It's not fair that he won't let us in." Without waiting for a response, Tom headed out the door, the cool night air hitting him as he stepped into the street. He walked quickly, his mind racing with thoughts of Daniel and the unresolved tension between them. He didn't fully understand why this had become so important to him, but he knew he needed answers. When he arrived at the diner, it was late, and the usual quiet hum of activity had slowed to a near standstill. There were only a few patrons left, and Daniel was wiping down the counter, his usual silent and efficient self. Tom took a deep breath and approached him. "Daniel," he said, his voice low but firm. Daniel looked up, surprised to see him at this hour. "Tom," he replied with a nod. "Everything okay?" "No," Tom said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Everything's not okay. Why won't you let us help you? Why do you keep pushing us away?" Daniel blinked, taken aback by the directness of the question. He put down the cloth he had been using and folded his arms. "I've told you before, I don't need anything from you." "That's not the point," Tom shot back. "We're not trying to pay you back. We're trying to be your friends, to do something for you like you did for us. But every time we try, you push us away. Why?" Daniel was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed and gestured for Tom to sit at the counter. "You don't understand," he said softly, his voice calm but serious. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything." "We don't feel like that," Tom replied, leaning forward, his frustration giving way to a mix of desperation and confusion. We want to give something back. We want to help you the way you helped us." Daniel shook his head slowly. "You're not the first people I've helped, and you won't be the last. That's just what I do. It's how I live my life. I don't expect anything in return. That's not why I do it." "But why?" Tom pressed. "Why do you keep yourself so closed off? Don't you want to let people in? Don't you want something more than this?" Daniel hesitated, his eyes flickering with something Tom couldn't quite read. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he said, "I've learned that sometimes letting people in only makes things harder. Sometimes it's easier to just keep my distance." Tom stared at him, the weight of those words sinking in. He had never thought about it that way. He had assumed that Daniel was just stubborn, but now he realized that Daniel's distance was a form of protection, both for himself and for others. "I'm sorry," Tom said after a moment, his voice softening. "I didn't realize." Daniel gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's okay. You and Sarah are good people. I'm glad I could help you, but don't feel like you have to repay me. Just live your lives. Be happy. That's enough for me." Tom nodded, a mixture of understanding and sadness settling over him. He stood to leave, but before he did, he turned back to Daniel one last time. You deserve to be happy too." Daniel didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said everything. In the weeks that followed, things at the diner began to change. The usual slow pace of business became even slower, and it was clear that something was wrong. The regulars still came in, but their numbers were dwindling, and there were fewer and fewer new faces each day. One afternoon, as Daniel was taking inventory in the back, the diner's owner, Mr. Jennings, approached him with a grim expression. Mr. Jennings was an older man, nearing retirement age, and had owned the diner for decades. But lately, he had been more withdrawn, his once jovial nature replaced by a quiet sense of worry. "Daniel," Mr. Jennings said, his voice heavy. "We need to talk." Daniel looked up from his clipboard, immediately sensing the seriousness of the situation. "What's going on?" Mr. Jennings sighed and leaned against the counter, rubbing his temples. "The diner, it's not doing well. Business has been slow for a while now, and I've been trying to keep things afloat, but we're not bringing in enough to cover costs. I'm afraid if things don't turn around soon, we might have to close." Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach. The diner had been his steady anchor for years, a place where he could lose himself in the routine of work and forget about the struggles of his past. The idea of losing it felt like losing a part of himself. "Is there anything we can do?" Daniel asked, his voice quiet but urgent. Mr. Jennings shook his head. "I don't know. I've been looking into selling, but there's not much interest. People aren't investing in small businesses like this anymore. It's all chains and franchises now." Daniel stood there for a moment, the weight of the news pressing down on him. The diner wasn't just a job for him. It was a place where he had found a sense of purpose, even if it was just in the small acts of kindness he performed for the customers who came through the door. "What about the staff?" Daniel asked, his mind racing. What will happen to us? Mr. Jennings looked at him with a tired expression. I don't know yet. I'll try to give as much notice as I can, but if we don't turn things around soon, well, we might not have a choice. As Mr. Jennings walked away, Daniel felt a growing sense of dread. The diner had been a constant in his life for so long, and the thought of losing it made him feel unmoored. He didn't know what he would do without it, and the idea of finding another job, starting over somewhere else, felt overwhelming. That evening, as Daniel cleaned up after the last customer had left, he stood at the window, staring out at the empty street. The diner had been a lifeline for him, a place where he could exist without drawing too much attention, where he could help others without needing anything in return. But now, it seemed that lifeline was slipping away. The news of the diner's potential closure weighed heavily on Daniel. Over the next few days, it was all he could think about as he moved through his shifts, quietly observing the dwindling number of customers and the growing tension in Mr. Jennings' demeanor. Every empty seat felt like another nail in the coffin, and Daniel began to feel a sense of helplessness creeping over him. Meanwhile, things between Sarah and Tom hadn't improved much. The revelation about Daniel's past had given them a brief moment of understanding, but their own struggles remained. Tom had found a few more odd jobs, but it wasn't enough to lift the weight of their financial burdens. Sarah's search for a stable job continued to be fruitless, and the pressure of their situation was taking its toll. One evening, as they sat in their small apartment, Sarah brought up the possibility of leaving town again. "We can't stay here much longer, Tom," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "We're barely making it, and there's no sign of things getting better." Tom, sitting at the edge of the couch with his head in his hands, let out a heavy sigh. "I know," he muttered, "but where do we go? We don't have the money to just pack up and leave." "We can't stay here forever, waiting for things to magically improve," Sarah replied, her voice rising slightly. "We need to do something. We're stuck, Tom. We're stuck in this town, stuck in this cycle, and if we don't make a change, it's only going to get worse." Tom stood up, pacing across the small living room, his frustration evident in every step. "I don't know what to do, Sarah. I'm trying. Every day, I'm out there trying to find work, trying to make things better, but nothing is changing. What do you want me to do?" "I want us to figure out," Sarah said softly, her anger giving way to exhaustion. "Together." The silence between them stretched on, the weight of their situation pressing down on both of them. They wanted to make things work, but the path forward seemed unclear, and each passing day only deepened their sense of frustration and uncertainty. As they sat together in that tense silence, Sarah thought of Daniel. If anyone understood what they were going through, it was him. But unlike them, Daniel seemed to have accepted his circumstances. He wasn't trying to change his situation, and that was something Sarah couldn't understand. She admired him for his kindness, but she couldn't help but feel frustrated by his willingness to remain where he was, stuck, just like them. "I think we need to talk to Daniel again," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence. Tom looked up at her, surprised. "What good will that do?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but he helped us before. Maybe he can help us again, or maybe we can help him this time. The diner is struggling, and I can't shake the feeling that Daniel needs help, even if he won't admit it." Tom frowned, but he nodded slowly. "Okay, we'll talk to him." The next day, Sarah and Tom made their way to the diner, determined to talk to Daniel about everything that had been weighing on them. The walk there was filled with quiet anticipation, both of them unsure of what exactly they would say, but knowing that the conversation was necessary. When they arrived, the diner was almost empty. It was midday, and only a few regulars sat at their usual spots, sipping coffee and chatting quietly. Mr. Jennings stood behind the counter, his expression tired and worn. Daniel moved through the diner as he always did, quiet and efficient, though the usual calmness in his demeanor seemed to be absent. Sarah and Tom took their usual seat by the window, waiting for Daniel to approach. When he did, they could see the weariness in his eyes, and it only solidified Sarah's determination to speak up. "Daniel," Sarah began, her voice gentle but firm, "we know about the diner. Mr. Jennings told you, didn't he?" Daniel paused, his expression guarded. "Yeah," he replied quietly. "He told me." "We want to help," Tom added. "We've been trying to figure things out for ourselves, but we also want to help you. The diner means something to you, doesn't it?" Daniel glanced around the diner, his eyes lingering on the empty tables and worn booths. "It's been a part of my life for a long time," he admitted. "But I don't know if there's anything we can do. Business is slow, and it's not just the diner. The whole town is struggling." "We don't have much," Sarah said, leaning forward. "But we can't just sit by and watch everything fall apart. Maybe we can come up with something together, an idea to bring in more customers, or maybe find a way to keep the diner going. We can't give up without trying." Daniel's eyes softened slightly, but he still seemed hesitant. "I appreciate what you're saying," he replied, "but this isn't your fight. You've got your own problems to worry about. I don't want to drag you into this." "We're already in it," Tom said, his voice steady. "We're all struggling, and maybe if we work together, we can find a way through this. You helped us when we needed it, and now we want to do the same for you." Daniel was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting out the window. He had spent so long keeping others at arm's length, convinced that his struggles were his alone to bear. But now, faced with Sarah and Tom's earnest desire to help, he began to wonder if he had been wrong. "There's something else," Daniel said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something I haven't told anyone." Sarah and Tom exchanged a glance, their curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Sarah asked gently. Daniel hesitated, but then, with a deep breath, he began to speak. "Before I came here, I lost everything. My job, my apartment, everything. I was homeless for months, living out of my car. And during that time, someone helped me. Someone who didn't expect anything in return. They gave me a place to stay, food to eat, a chance to start over. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for them." His voice wavered slightly as he continued. "But I didn't stay in touch with them. I couldn't. I was too ashamed. I couldn't face them, knowing that I hadn't done anything with the second chance they gave me. So I came here, to this town, and I've been hiding ever since." Sarah and Tom listened in silence, their hearts heavy with the weight of Daniel's confession. It was clear now why Daniel had always kept his distance, why he had been so reluctant to accept their help. He had been carrying the burden of his past for so long, believing that he didn't deserve the kindness that had been shown to him. "You don't have to hide anymore," Sarah said softly. "We're not here to judge you. We just want to help. Let us help." For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt something shift inside him, a small flicker of hope, of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry this burden alone anymore. The next few days marked a significant change for Daniel, Sarah, and Tom. For the first time since they had met, the three of them were united by a shared purpose. The revelation of Daniel's past had opened up a new level of understanding between them, and now they were determined to save the diner together. Sarah, ever resourceful, immediately began brainstorming ideas to help increase business at the diner. "We need to bring people back in," she said, sitting with Tom and Daniel after the lunch rush, which had been disappointingly slow. "There has to be something we can do to make this place a spot people want to visit again." Tom nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Maybe we can start with small changes," he suggested. "The diner's been the same for years, right? What if we freshen it up a bit? New menu items, a weekly event to draw on the locals." Daniel, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "Mr. Jennings isn't going to want to invest in anything too risky," he said. "He's already stretched thin. But small changes could work, as long as they don't cost too much." Sarah smiled. "Exactly. We don't need a big budget to make a difference. We just need to give people a reason to come back." They spent the next few hours tossing around ideas, their energy fueled by a shared sense of urgency. By the time the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, they had a solid plan in place. It was simple but effective. Weekly events like trivia nights and live music, a few new menu items, and some low-cost renovations to brighten up the diner's interior. The following week, they got to work. Tom, who had some experience with repairs and handiwork, took on the task of sprucing upped the diner's decor. He painted the walls a fresh, inviting color and replaced the worn-out curtains with brighter, more modern ones. Sarah worked with Mr. Jennings to design a new, streamlined menu that featured a few signature dishes, something to make the diner stand out. Daniel, in his quiet way, continued to handle the day-to-day operations of the diner, but there was a noticeable change in him. He was more engaged, more willing to share ideas and contribute to the effort. The burden he had carried for so long seemed lighter now that he wasn't carrying it alone. As the renovations began to take shape, word started to spread around town. Regular customers who had drifted away came back to check out the changes, and soon enough, new faces began to appear as well. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was a start. One evening, after a particularly successful trivia night, Sarah, Tom, and Daniel sat together at a booth, watching the last few customers trickle out. The diner was still quiet compared to its heyday, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Something lighter, more hopeful. "You know," Tom said, leaning back in his seat, "I think we might actually pull this off." Sarah smiled, exhaustion and satisfaction mingling in her expression. "We're getting there," she agreed, slowly but surely. Daniel, who had been quietly sipping his coffee, looked around the diner. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The changes they had made were starting to take effect, but the battle to save the diner was far from over. As the weeks passed, the diner's finances improved, but it was still not enough to guarantee long-term survival. Mr. Jennings had been cautiously optimistic, but even he knew that without a significant boost in business, the diner's future was still uncertain. "We need something big," Sarah said one afternoon, her voice firm with determination. "Something that will really draw people in, get the whole town talking." Tom nodded in agreement. "But what? We've already done the events and the menu changes. What more can we do?" Daniel, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "What if we had a community event? Something that gets everyone involved, not just to bring them to the diner, but to make them feel like this place is part of their lives." Sarah looked at him, intrigued. "What kind of event?" Daniel leaned forward, his eyes thoughtful. "Something that gives back. A fundraiser, maybe, or a charity event. We could partner with local businesses, get them involved. If people feel like the diner is doing something good for the community, they'll be more likely to support it." Tom's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea. We could hold the event right here at the diner. Maybe a cook-off or a silent auction. Something fun but meaningful." Sarah smiled, the spark of hope reigniting in her chest. "I love it. And if we get the local press involved, we could get even more attention. This could be exactly what we need." Over the next few days, they threw themselves into planning the event. Sarah reached out to local businesses, convincing them to donate items for the auction, while Tom worked on organizing the cook-off. Daniel, who had always preferred to stay in the background, found himself stepping into a more active role, reaching out to customers and spreading the word. As the day of the event approached, the excitement around town began to grow. People were talking about the diner in a way they hadn't in years, and the sense of community that Daniel had hoped to foster was starting to take shape. On the day of the event, the diner was packed. The cook-off was a hit, with locals competing to see who could whip up the best dishes, while the silent auction raised more money than anyone had expected. People laughed, talked, and shared meals together, the atmosphere buzzing with energy. For Daniel, it was a surreal experience. He had spent so much of his life in the background, watching others from a distance. But now, here he was, right in the middle of it all, part of something bigger than himself. As the night drew to a close, Mr. Jennings approached Daniel, his eyes misty with emotion. "You did it, Daniel," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You saved this place." Daniel shook his head, a small smile on his lips. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "It was all of us." The event had been a success, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a sense of peace. The diner wasn't just a place to work. It was a place where people came together, where lives intertwined in ways that were both ordinary and extraordinary. As he stood by the door, watching the last few customers leave, Daniel felt a quiet sense of pride. He had spent so long believing that his past defined him, that he didn't deserve a second chance he had been given. But now, as he looked around at the faces of the people he had helped bring together, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had earned his place here. Despite the success of the community event, the future of the diner remained uncertain. While the money raised at the auction had helped cover some of the immediate costs, it wasn't enough to guarantee long-term survival. The diner still needed consistent business to stay open, and Daniel, Sarah, and Tom knew they had to keep pushing forward. Over the next few weeks, they continued their efforts to draw in more customers. They expanded their outreach, putting up flyers around town, posting on social media, and even talking to local radio stations to spread the word. Every small victory was celebrated, but the strain of the situation was beginning to take its toll. One evening, after another long day of work, Daniel sat alone at the counter, staring into his cup of coffee. He had given everything he had to this effort, his time, his energy, his heart. But there were moments, like this one, when he wondered if it would ever be enough. As he sat in the quiet of the empty diner, Mr. Jennings approached him, his expression weary but kind. "Daniel," he said softly, sitting down next to him, "I've been thinking." Daniel glanced up, his brow furrowed. "About what?" Mr. Jennings sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "About the future of this place. I'm not getting any younger, and I can't keep running this diner forever. Even with all the improvements we've made, it's going to take a lot more to keep this place going in the long term." Daniel nodded, understanding the weight of what Mr. Jennings was saying. He had known for a while that the older man was nearing retirement age, and the stress of running the diner had only made things harder for him. "What are you going to do?" Daniel asked quietly. Mr. Jennings looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "I've decided to sell the diner, but I don't want to sell it to just anyone. I want you to take it over." Daniel's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? I don't." "I know you don't think you're ready," Mr. Jennings interrupted gently. "But you are. You've put your heart and soul into this place. You've kept it alive when no one else could. I know you can do this." Daniel was silent, the weight of Mr. Jennings' words settling over him. The thought of owning the diner had never crossed his mind. He had always been content working quietly in the background, helping where he could, but never taking center stage. But now, the opportunity to take control of his own future was right in front of him, and it terrified him. "I don't know if I can," Daniel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never run a business before." "You don't have to do it alone," Mr. Jennings replied with a small smile. "You've got Sarah and Tom, and you've got the whole community behind you now. You've proven that this place means something to people. They'll support you." Daniel stared down at his coffee, his mind racing. He had spent so long believing that he didn't deserve a second chance, that his past would always define him. But now, for the first time, he was being given the opportunity to take control of his own destiny. It was a daunting thought, but it was also exhilarating. After a long moment of silence, Daniel looked up at Mr. Jennings. "I'll think about it," he said softly. Mr. Jennings nodded, his expression understanding. "Take your time. But know this, Daniel, you've earned this." As Mr. Jennings left the diner, Daniel sat alone in the quiet, his mind swirling with thoughts of the future. He had spent so much of his life hiding from his past, but now he had the chance to build something new, something that was his. The decision weighed heavily on Daniel over the next few days. He had always been the type to stay in the background, content to let others take the lead. But now, faced with the opportunity to take over the diner, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment he had been waiting for, a chance to finally step forward and claim his place in the world. He discussed the possibility with Sarah and Tom one evening, the three of them sitting together in the now familiar booth by the window. Sarah was immediately supportive, her eyes lighting up with excitement at the prospect. "Daniel, this is your chance," she said, her voice filled with encouragement. "You've worked so hard for this place. You've earned the right to make it your own." Tom nodded in agreement. "We're with you no matter what. We'll help you every step of the way." Daniel smiled, touched by their unwavering support. He had come to rely on Sarah and Tom in ways he never expected, and their belief in him gave him the courage to consider the possibility of running the diner. But there were still doubts lingering in the back of his mind. Could he really take on such a responsibility? What if he failed? What if the diner, despite all their efforts, still couldn't survive? As the days passed, Daniel found himself reflecting on his past, the struggles he had faced, the kindness he had received from strangers, and the journey that had brought him to this moment. He realized that everything he had been through had led him here. The diner wasn't just a job to him anymore. It was a symbol of everything he had overcome. One evening, after the diner had closed for the night, Daniel stood alone in the middle of the empty dining room. The familiar sights and sounds of the diner surrounded him. The clinking of silverware, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft glow of the lights. It felt like home. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his moment. He knew it now. The next morning, Daniel walked into the diner with a sense of purpose. He found Mr. Jennings sitting at the counter, sipping his usual cup of coffee. When Mr. Jennings looked up and saw the determination in Daniel's eyes, he smiled. "You've made a decision," Mr. Jennings said knowingly. Daniel nodded. "I'll do it," he said firmly. "I'll take over the diner." Mr. Jennings beamed, pride and relief evident in his expression. "I knew you would." Over the next few weeks, the transition began. Mr. Jennings guided Daniel through the process of taking ownership, teaching him the ins and outs of running a business. It was a steep learning curve, but Daniel tackled it with the same quiet determination that had carried him through so many challenges before. Sarah and Tom were there every step of the way, helping with everything from managing the finances to planning new events to keep the community engaged. The support from the townspeople was overwhelming, and soon enough, the diner was bustling with life again. On the day the ownership officially transferred to Daniel, the diner was packed with customers, friends, regulars, and even a few new faces who had heard about the changes. The atmosphere was filled with excitement and celebration, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a sense of pride that he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. As the evening wound down and the last few customers trickled out, Daniel stood at the door, watching the night settle over the town. Sarah and Tom stood beside him, their faces filled with satisfaction. "You did it," Sarah said softly, smiling up at him. "We did it," Daniel corrected, a rare but genuine smile spreading across his face. For the first time in years, Daniel felt at peace. He had spent so long believing that his past would define him, that he wasn't worthy of the second chance he had been given. But now, standing at the door of the diner he called his own, he realized that he had earned every bit of happiness that had come his way. This was a new beginning, not just for the diner, but for Daniel himself. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to embrace it. Hey there, if you enjoyed The Silent Waiter, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. It helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. We'd love to hear from you. What moment in the story impacted you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have any ideas for new stories you'd like to see on the channel, share them with us. Your suggestions could inspire our next big story. Thanks for watching and being part of this community.